Well, I mean, I think it's definitely clear that the overarching thing going on between China and Russia is like forming more of a united front against the West, the United States, NATO, the EU. Because for some reason, we keep complaining about the genocide and the military aggression.
I do think that it'll be interesting to see how long people play along with the Xi Jinping's like China as a peacemaker thing. Because if you look at a lot of what he was saying when he was in Russia, most of it was about how this is NATO's fault.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where the CCP and like Putin, they align in terms of not in terms of like what's happening in the war necessarily, because I think that China would also be fine if there wasn't a war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, okay, this is NATO is the baddie and we need to keep them out and anything is justified in order to do that.
Well, Chinese state-run media has also been essentially pushing Russian disinformation about the Ukraine war all along. Haven't they been pushing the, denazification kind of route?
Yeah, and definitely the whole, I think we did an entire episode about how they were blaming all of this on NATO, and there were some really weird, like, political cartoons that they had made.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would even call them political cartoons because they were almost like also AI images in a way. Like they were CGI-ish stuff about Harry Potter. Do you remember this? Where they compared NATO to Voldemort?
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
It sounds like it'd be relevant.
Because it has Horcruxes across Europe. Yeah.
But there were several different articles about how terrible NATO was. There was like an entire series, but in one of them, it was about how NATO was basically Voldemort.
Are we sure they're talking about NATO or natto, that Japanese fermented bean thing? Because I can't stand that.
That's bad. That's Voldemort, in your opinion?
Totally. It's a weird fermented life form.
Yeah.
Distorted.
I think Chris is right.
That might be spelled with 2 T's.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. America is the Dark Lord.
Oh.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Here it is.
What? It's so weird. There's a lot going on there. China does seem to be leaning heavily into like AI stuff. Like they had another thing about an AI TV anchor. I think they're really just good. And like that's obviously like some weird AI political cartoon. Like, I think they're just really trying to take the people element out of communism.
And how do you take the people out of the people?
You kill them.
Well, no. I think this is what Mao said in his People's Democratic Dictatorship speech, that, like, there are certain people who are the people. And then there are the other people who are not the people, like the rightists, the counter-revolutionaries, the running dogs for the West. Those are not people.
Some people are more people than the others.
Yes, I think that was the point.
Yeah. And so really this is what, Xi and Putin were saying, that like they're trying to make this communist world empire again.
It's their time.
It's their time.
Yeah, but so it's interesting to see like the US and the EU still try to kind of
see China as like a potential peacemaker.
Well, I don't think they actually see it as a potential peacemaker, but they're kind of making those noises, right? In terms of being like, oh yeah, we welcome more solutions. And
yeah, China could do something.
Yeah, I mean, it worked out so well with North Korea.
Meanwhile, it sure seems like China is selling weapons to Russia.
No, I mean, it's just Chinese companies selling assault rifles.
Yeah.
To Russian companies.
It's not, they're not selling, and body armor. It's actually quite sad to see. My sister sent me this Reddit post that had like a screenshot from, I don't know if it was Alibaba. It was one of the Chinese e-commerce sites. And it was selling kind of like body armor, and the reviews, the comments were all from like Russians who had ordered the body armor from China because their own military wasn't providing enough body armor. So these people get drafted or whatever, right? Yeah. And they have to buy their own body armor.
What, were the reviews good?
I mean, if there were bad reviews, probably those people wouldn't be around to leave them anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's dark.
But yeah, so that was kind of sad to see, but also the assault rifles and things like that. But that's not, the U.S. is saying, well, that's not that doesn't count.
Well,
right?
that's so weird about what the U.S. is doing, because they're like, it is China cannot sell weapons to Russia, but they're leaving the loophole open of like Chinese companies in a totalitarian communist system where the government controls all industry. If a Chinese company sells weapons to a Russian company, which is also entirely controlled by the government, that's okay. That's not the same thing.
Well, as selling directly artillery or something, I guess.
Seems pretty weak.
I mean, maybe we'll see Chinese companies selling artillery shells to Russian companies, or Chinese companies selling, other.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to keep this loophole. And here's the reason. So if the U.S. formally recognizes that Chinese companies selling weapons to Russian companies is equivalent to China selling Russia weapons, then the U.S. has a kind of political obligation to take action against China. For example, sanctioning China the same way we sanction Russia, or but think about how devastating those sanctions would be. The amount of trade that the U.S. does with China is like more than an order of magnitude above what we do with Russia. So losing trade with Russia, the U.S. economy can withstand without too big of a blip. But sanctioning China in that same way would cause such an enormous and immediate negative impact on U.S. industry and commerce that it would be politically very difficult. And you have to think about what the ramifications of that would be. So,
have you been bought off by the engagement school?
Well, let me finish explaining this, and then you can answer that. So, you've got an administration that is, as any administration would be, is looking at re-election in less than 2 years, and an economic hit from putting meaningful sanctions on China would be so big it would last at least up until that election. And so, because Americans may not understand the nuances of this, it'd be easy to say, oh, well, the Biden administration did something to wreck our economy.
Which people already are saying.
Yeah. And so that's going to hurt the chances of Biden or Harris or whoever the DNC runs from getting elected. And that is a huge political problem. And so even if sanctions are the morally right thing to do to stop China from helping Russia kill civilians in Ukraine, it's politically a very dangerous thing to do. And I think that's why we're certainly not going to see Congress united on something like that. We're not going to see the Biden administration do it unless they absolutely are really, really forced to.
Unless Xi Jinping actually shows up with missiles.
Right. Well, and I think that it's important to I would like to see some incident that's like a spy balloon type incident, which everyone can kind of unite around, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, and say, oh, here's a reason that the U.S. has to put those sanctions on China for this, because that will force the Biden administration's hand. And it also will be like, well, it's not the Biden administration's fault. They had to do this. And so then I think that Democratic voters, or swing voters are really the important ones in a presidential election, voters will be like, yeah, it's not really Biden's fault.
Well, I mean, U.S. elections are almost never about foreign policy.
Right. But so that's the point. It's like the only way the Biden administration can do that is if something happens that forces them to do it in such a public way that voters excuse them for that.
I can see what you're saying. What I find interesting about this whole scenario, though, is that nobody forced the Biden administration to publicly say or warn that China was thinking of selling weapons to Russia and they better not, or else there would be consequences, right?
Yeah, that is interesting.
Because that, now you're kind of asking them to call your bluff if you don't really mean it.
Like, you can't draw a red line if you don't intend to enforce it.
Yeah, so if the sanctions are as devastating as you're talking about, Matt, then why would they say this in the first place? Are they just hoping that by kind of shining a light on this, like the CCP will be too scared to sell Russia weapons now?
I think that might have been the calculation. I mean, there also could be people within the Biden administration who actually do want to sanction China in a much harsher way.
Well, I think it's good if, the American people become aware of the fact that China is selling weapons to Russia for fighting in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean,
and then that can create pressure.
I've seen some comments in our videos that say, well, what's the big deal? I mean, the U.S. is selling Ukraine weapons. Why can't China sell weapons to Russia?
Well, that's worth answering that question.
Yes. You want to answer it?
I was going to offer you. Okay, so my view is this. China can sell weapons to Russia, but given that, if Russia's the enemy of Ukraine in this war, China joins Russia, so China's the enemy of Ukraine, and if the U.S. is allied with Ukraine, then China essentially becomes officially an enemy of the U.S. So China can absolutely do that, but the consequence is that then they become an enemy. So the U.S. is publicly being like, hey, we are allied with Ukraine, and we're taking that stance, and we are 100% on board with that. So China either chooses to oppose us and be at war officially in an official sense, or they try to pretend like they're neutral. And that way they don't get sanctioned, right?
Well, I mean, also there's a pretty big difference between giving weapons to a side that is defending their country from a much larger, hostile, authoritarian military industrial complex and then giving weapons to Russia.
The side that's
doing
actively trying to invade another country?
Yeah, I mean, that's the moral side of it. But I'm just in terms of the political side, China can make whatever choice it wants. And the choice is between being at war with the U.S. and not being at war with the U.S. And they do get to make that choice.
I think the important thing to remember here is that America is Voldemort. So, obviously, if China was forced to sell weapons to Russia, they're only justified in trying to counter the aggression of America and NATO.
They're part of the resistance.
I mean, everybody's the hero of their own story.